There is a moment in certain old photographs where you can see it. Not in the dress, not in the flowers, in the eyes. A stillness that does not belong to celebration. A composure that was not chosen. Something behind the gaze that had already accepted what was coming. Not with peace, but with the particular kind of quiet that arrives when a person has understood there is no other door, no other corridor, no other version of the morning that does not end here, in this room, in this dress, surrounded by people who are celebrating something she has not been asked to celebrate. We have been taught to see weddings as beginnings. History asks us to look again. Across every continent, across every century that left records behind, marriage was wrapped in ceremony. White fabric or red silk, garlands or veils, drums or hymns. The details change. The architecture of the moment remains the same. A family gathered, a threshold crossed, two lives formally joined before witnesses who would remember and report. We were told this was protection. For many women throughout history, it was something else entirely. It was a transfer, not a beginning, a handover, of a person, her labor, her body, her name, her future, passed from one set of hands to another with the solemnity of a legal transaction and the finality of a door closing from the outside. The ceremony was real, the music was real, the flowers were real. What was not real was the idea that any of it had been arranged for her benefit. This is not the story of a single culture's cruelty or a single era's ignorance. This is the story of a pattern, persistent, cross-continental, dressed in celebration, in which the architecture of marriage was designed not around partnership, but around control, around the systematic management of women's bodies, labor, loyalty, and silence, around the maintenance of a world in which half the population remained, at the most consequential moments of their lives, legally and socially voiceless, and what that architecture left behind. To understand what marriage was for most of recorded history, you have to remove the romantic frame entirely. Not because romance did not exist, it did, in pockets, in poetry, in private letters discovered centuries later, but because romance was never the governing logic. The governing logic was property. The governing logic was inheritance. The governing logic was the consolidation of power between men who needed other men to trust them, and who used the bodies of women to build that trust. Before she married, a woman existed in one legal and economic household. After she married, she existed in another. The ceremony was not a celebration of love, it was the paperwork. The white fabric and the gathered family were not incidental decoration. They were witnesses to a transaction that had already been concluded without her, in rooms she had not entered, between people whose names would appear on documents, while hers appeared only in relation to theirs. Families negotiated marriages the way states negotiate treaties, with attention to land, titles, alliances, bloodlines, and strategic advantage. Daughters were assets to be deployed at the moment of maximum utility. Their marriages opened trade routes, sealed peace agreements between rival families, consolidated estates, and prevented wars that no one else had managed to prevent through diplomacy alone. The bride herself was, in the language of the ledger, the agreement. She was not asked to sign it. In medieval Europe, noble families arranged marriages for daughters as young as 12, 13, 14, not because men of that era were uniquely monstrous, but because the calculation had nothing to do with the girl's experience. It had to do with timing. A daughter of marriageable age was a resource with a limited window. Delay was waste. Sentiment was inefficiency. The feelings of the person being transferred were not an entry in the ledger that anyone was required to balance. This logic was not confined to Europe. In imperial China, marriages were arranged through intermediaries who negotiated terms between families before the bride and groom ever met. In the Ottoman court, alliances were cemented through strategic unions. In parts of pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa, in the highlands of South Asia, in the river settlements of South America, the pattern held. The ceremony varied, the underlying contract did not. The marriage was always, beneath its decorations, a political document.
and the bride was always, beneath her flowers, a signature. She was the agreement. The celebration was for everyone else. The question of age haunts this history more than almost any other, not because historians have only recently understood its significance. Many early observers documented it with visible discomfort, but because the legal and social systems that governed marriage consistently failed to treat it as disqualifying. The systems looked at a child standing at the threshold of a life she had not chosen, and they decided this was in order, appropriate, traditional. The word traditional performing enormous labor to prevent anyone from asking the next question. In 17th century England, the common law set the minimum age of marriage at 12 for girls. In colonial America, the laws followed similar thresholds. In parts of the Indian subcontinent, girls were married before puberty with the understanding that they would join their husband's household only upon reaching a certain age, though the promise of that delay was not always honored. What these ages shared was not culture exactly, but a common indifference to the interior life of the child involved. The question that was not being asked was not whether the system was working, but whether the child had a self worth consulting, whether her experience of crossing that threshold was a fact that merited inclusion in anyone's calculation. The young bride was not a person being entered into a contract. She was a contract being signed. And the man who signed her was her husband, a man who, in most legal systems of the time, was granted sweeping authority over her body, her movement, her decisions, and her future. Authority backed by law, authority enforced by community, authority so thoroughly embedded in the social fabric that questioning it required a kind of courage most people could not afford, and a language most people had not been given permission to use.
In these marriages, consent was not merely absent, it was impossible. You cannot consent to something that is being decided around you, above you, without your voice ever being considered part of the conversation. The girl who was delivered to a ceremony she did not choose, to a household she had never entered, to a stranger she was now required to obey. She was not consenting, she was complying. The two have never been the same thing, no matter how many centuries tried to use them interchangeably. Marriage for these girls was not a choice made for them, it was a choice made instead of them. Money, it turns out, is a more honest language than ceremony. The economic structures surrounding marriage, the dowry, the bride price, the trousseau, the settlement of debts through daughters, reveal what the ceremony tried to obscure. Strip away the music and the garlands, and what remains is arithmetic. The unambiguous arithmetic of who is worth what, and what is owed to whom, and who is required to make good on the debt. In the dowry systems of South Asia and parts of Southern Europe, a bride's family was expected to deliver wealth to the groom's household upon marriage: land, gold, cattle, cash, furniture, silk. The amount was negotiated in advance with the precision of a business contract. The failure to deliver had consequences: social humiliation at minimum, violence at worst. In regions where the dowry system grew most severe over centuries, families viewed the birth of a daughter with dread, not celebration. She was an expense that would eventually come due. The bride price tradition, common in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, moved the economic transaction in the opposite direction. The groom's family paid the bride's family for the marriage. In its original cultural logic, this was often an honorable practice, a recognition of the woman's value, a gesture of respect and commitment. In many communities, across many generations, it functioned exactly that way. But economic systems have a way of corrupting their own intentions. When a price has been paid for a woman, the people who paid it tend to believe they have purchased something: her labor, her compliance, her obedience, her body. The logic of the transaction, once allowed to enter the marriage, rarely stayed outside the door where it had been made.
Families who had paid bride prices sometimes treated wives as property to be retrieved or exchanged if the marriage did not satisfy the men who had arranged it. Families who had received payments sometimes refused to take daughters back if marriages turned cruel because returning the wife meant returning the money, and the money was gone, spent, dispersed, never intended to be returned. She was not allowed to be a loss. These systems were not invented by malicious men in smoke-filled rooms. They emerged from genuine social logics built around scarcity, around uncertainty, around the practical need to establish trust between families who would be bound together by this union for generations. The cultural frameworks were real. The intentions, in many instances, were not cruel, but the consequences were. And the consequences were predictable. Because any system that attaches a monetary value to a human being, regardless of the direction of payment, regardless of the cultural meaning assigned to the transaction, eventually begins to treat that human being as the thing it has priced them as: an asset, a liability, a cost-benefit calculation wearing a face. In 1765, the English jurist William Blackstone articulated what had already been true in English common law for centuries. By marriage, he wrote, the husband and wife are one person in law. He meant it literally. Under the doctrine of coverture, a woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. She ceased, in the eyes of the law, to exist as an independent entity. She could not own property independently, she could not enter contracts in her own name, she could not sue or be sued, she could not control her own earnings. Everything she brought into the marriage became his. Everything she would earn, inherit, or receive during the marriage, all of it became his. She had not died, but legally she had disappeared. This was not a fringe interpretation of the law. This was the law. In England, in the American colonies and the early United States, in varying forms across much of continental Europe. The doctrine was not controversial among those who wrote it, enforced it, and benefited from it. It was understood as natural, as logical, as the right and proper arrangement of domestic life, confirmed by tradition, ratified by theology, encoded into statute, and enforced by every court that took the question seriously enough to consider it. A woman who walked into a church as an individual walked out as a legal appendage. The marriage certificate did not join two lives, it erased one of them. And this erasure was not metaphorical, it had direct, daily, devastating consequences. Women who found themselves in harmful marriages could not leave and take their children, because the children legally belonged to the father. Women whose husbands gambled away their inheritance had no legal recourse, because the inheritance had legally become his the moment they married. Women who tried to establish themselves in commerce in any sphere outside the domestic found that the law itself was the wall. Every door had a lock to which only a husband held the key. There were narrow exceptions. A wealthy family with foresight could establish a trust before a wedding, a legal structure that technically protected a daughter's inheritance from vanishing into her husband's hands. But this protection was available only to those who could afford lawyers, who knew such instruments existed, who had the social power to negotiate from a position of strength before the ceremony made negotiation impossible. For everyone else, marriage was a legal disappearance, and the system had decided this was fine. Control in marriage rarely operated in isolation. It was embedded in something larger, in honor systems that governed how communities saw themselves, how families maintained status, and how women understood their own value inside the only world that had been made available to them.
In honor-based social structures, which have appeared across Mediterranean cultures, Middle Eastern societies, parts of South Asia, and within early modern Europe, a family's reputation was inextricably tied to the behavioral conduct of its women. A daughter who refused a marriage brought shame on her family's name. A wife who disobeyed publicly brought shame. A widow who remarried too quickly brought shame. A woman seen speaking with the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong hour brought shame onto her husband, her father, and her sons. The shame was communal. It was inherited by children and carried into grandchildren. It followed families across generations like a debt that never fully cleared. This meant that the enforcement of female compliance was not left to husbands alone. It was outsourced to the entire community, to mothers-in-law who monitored and reported, to neighbors who logged movement, to religious authorities who defined permissible conduct from positions of absolute social authority, to other women, crucially, women who had accepted the system and now enforced it on the next generation, because enforcing it was the only form of power the system made available to them. A woman who resisted did not only face her husband, she faced everyone. The social isolation that followed resistance was not merely unpleasant. In historical contexts where women had no economic independence, no legal identity, and no access to resources outside the family unit, social isolation was a survival threat. To be cast out was to be left without food, shelter, or protection. There was no institution positioned to receive a woman who had stepped outside her assigned role. There was no safety net that did not have a condition attached to its use. The cage was not made of iron, it was made of reputation. And reputation in these systems was maintained through one mechanism only: obedience, sustained, visible, performed every day in front of witnesses who were also its enforcers. History has a particular skill for making the inexcusable invisible. For centuries, what a husband did within the walls of his home was considered private, a domestic matter beyond the reach of law, beneath the interest of courts that had more important business to attend to. The physical harm that could be inflicted by a man on his wife was not called violence. It was called correction, discipline, the appropriate exercise of marital authority, a husband maintaining order in his household, the kind of management the law had explicitly granted him, the community had quietly endorsed, and the church had declined to condemn. English common law once permitted a husband to physically discipline his wife, provided the instrument used was no thicker than his thumb. This rule was not fringe doctrine whispered in backward corners. It was referenced in courts. It was discussed by legal scholars with calm, professional objectivity. It was presented, without irony, as a reasonable and measured limitation on a right that was not itself being questioned. The limitation was for the husband's protection, not hers. Marital rape, the assault of a wife by her husband, was not recognized as a crime in most Western legal systems until the 20th century. Not the ancient world, not the medieval world, not the early modern period, the 20th century. Within living memory and countries that considered themselves the most developed, the most just, the most civilized in the world.
Blackstone's logic applied here too. A wife had, upon marriage, given irrevocable consent to her husband's use of her body. No individual act within that marriage could constitute a violation because the original contract had already conceded the territory. She had signed over access. The law had witnessed it and recorded it and filed it away as settled principle, requiring no further review. What this meant in practice was that within a marriage, a woman had no protected space. The harm was not hidden because it was shameful to those who inflicted it. It was hidden because the system had decided it was not harm at all. It had been reclassified, renamed, filed under a category that required no legal response and attracted no moral scrutiny from the institutions positioned to provide that scrutiny. Systems are more efficient at harm than individuals because systems do not feel guilt. The harm that occurred inside marriages throughout history was not the result of unusual men doing unusual things. It was the result of usual arrangements, legal frameworks, social expectations, religious authorities, and cultural norms that had collectively decided a wife's experience of her own marriage was not a matter of public concern, not a matter requiring protection, not a matter that appeared in the ledger under any heading that demanded action. And so it went largely unrecorded. Or rather, it was recorded in the only ledger that remained available, in the bodies of the women who lived it, in the silences of the daughters they raised, in the careful, invisible adjustments of behavior that generations of women made to stay safe inside the one institution they were not permitted to leave. The impossibility of exit shaped everything. When divorce was unavailable, legally, socially, economically, the calculus of survival inside a marriage shifted entirely. A woman could not leave, so she learned to endure, and the endurance required its own kind of dying, the gradual extinguishing of expectation, of hope, of self-definition outside the role she had been assigned, the slow setting aside of a self that had no safe place to be kept. In most European societies until the 19th century, divorce was either completely unavailable or accessible only through the church, a process so expensive, so complex, and so publicly humiliating that it was, in practice, reserved for the wealthiest. A woman in a harmful marriage who lacked wealth and connections had effectively no path out. The door was there, technically, it simply could not be opened without resources she was not permitted to accumulate. She could not return to her family. To do so was to bring shame. To admit the marriage had failed was to make herself unmarriageable, unemployable, and socially exiled. In cultures where a woman's entire worth was measured by her marital status, a woman who left her husband was worth nothing, less than nothing. She was a liability, a problem to be solved by placing her somewhere out of sight. Some women tried anyway. The historical record contains their attempts in fragments, in court testimonies where women described years of harm before finally seeking legal separation on the narrow grounds the law permitted, in letters to relatives that described desperation without naming it, coded in the cautious language of women who understood that being too explicit was its own kind of danger, in the accounts of women who entered convents not out of spiritual vocation, but because a convent was the only institution with walls that would shelter them without requiring another marriage.
The silence in the record is not an accident. Women who stayed did not speak. Women who left were made invisible. The history of women's experience inside marriage was shaped by the very systems that had the most to lose from an honest account. And so the account was never made honest. It was trimmed and adjusted and omitted until what remained looked like peace, until what remained looked like consent. What we have instead is the outline of what was removed, the shape of the silence, the negative space where testimony should be and is not. A woman can be broken without leaving a visible mark. The breaking leaves its trace in what she stopped doing, in the letters she stopped writing, in the rooms she stopped entering, in the opinions she stopped offering at tables where her opinion had never been solicited anyway, in the daughters she raised to expect nothing, not because she wanted them to expect nothing, but because she understood, with the precision of someone who has tested every wall, that expectation was a form of suffering she could at least spare them. This was the psychological permanence of the institution. Not the physical confinement, though that existed, but the internal reconstruction, the slow, systematic dismantling of a self that occurs when a person lives long enough inside a structure that has decided at every level that she does not matter enough to protect, that her comfort is not a legitimate consideration, that her silence is the sound of the system working correctly, that her accommodation of its demands is not sacrifice. It is simply her nature, her role, the thing she was always for. She was not broken by a single moment. She was worn down by the accumulation of moments, each small enough to be dismissed, each part of a pattern that no one around her was willing to name, because naming it would have required admitting that the institution everyone had agreed to celebrate was also the institution that was consuming her. But history does not belong entirely to the systems that built it. In the margins of the record, in the pages the powerful were not watching closely enough, women moved. They gathered. They organized in ways that the system had not thought to prohibit, because the system had not imagined they would think to do it. In England in the early 19th century, women began gathering in ways that had no precedent. They signed petitions with names the law did not recognize as having legal standing. They published arguments in their own voices.
They stood in public and said things that polite society had decided they had no authority to say, and they said them again when ignored, and again when mocked. The suffrage movement was not simply a campaign for the vote, it was a campaign for legal personhood, for the right to exist in the public record as something other than someone's wife. In 1882, the British Parliament passed the Married Women's Property Act. For the first time, a married woman in England could own property in her own name, could keep her own earnings, could enter contracts as herself. This was revolutionary, not because the right itself was extraordinary, men had always possessed it without remarking on it, but because it acknowledged something the law had been refusing to acknowledge for centuries, that a woman inside a marriage was still a person, still a legal entity with a name that belonged to her, still someone the state was obligated to recognize as having interests that did not automatically dissolve into her husband's. Across the Atlantic, American women fought parallel battles. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 had declared, and language deliberately borrowed from the Declaration of Independence, that all men and women are created equal. The legal road from that declaration to meaningful reform was long and contested and expensive, but it moved. Year by year, case by case, protest by protest, it moved. Minimum marriage age laws began to raise the legal floor, imperfectly, inconsistently. Laws addressing domestic violence began to enter the books. Marital rape was criminalized in the United Kingdom in 1991. In the United States, the last state to criminalize it did so in 1993. These are not ancient dates. The grandmothers of people alive today married under laws that did not recognize their right to refuse their own husbands. There is a version of this history that ends here, with reform, with progress, with the reassurance that things have changed. That version is not wrong. The progress was real, purchased by women who did not always live to benefit from what they fought for. The distance traveled from coverture to legal personhood, from arranged childhood marriage to contested minimum age laws. That distance is real, and it costs something to cover. But the architecture persists in the places where the reforms did not reach. In the communities where child marriage continues today, not as a remnant but as a functioning system sustained by poverty and inadequate enforcement. In the households where dowry-related violence continues in documented patterns. In the psychological architecture of the woman whose identity has been absorbed so completely into her household that she no longer possesses a language for what she has lost. These are not isolated failures. They are the persistence of a logic. The logic that decided, somewhere in the long history of human organization, that marriage was a mechanism of control, and that the person most controlled by it was also the person least entitled to object. What changes history is not the recognition of that logic, it is the refusal to accept it. Organized, sustained refusal, by the women who signed petitions with names the law would not honor, by the lawyers who argued cases no one thought they could win, by the daughters who asked questions that had been deliberately left unanswered, by the communities that decided their daughters deserved to enter a marriage as persons, not as signatures on a document written without them. Weddings still look the same in many of their essentials. White fabric, flowers, family gathered, music that promises something permanent, the moment at the threshold, the face of someone stepping through a door they are choosing to step through, or believe they are choosing to step through, which has not always been the same thing. We have made that choice real in many places. We have built legal floors. We have named rights that were not named before. We have moved in careful and contested increments closer to the version of marriage that the ceremony always implied but rarely delivered, where the partnership is actual, where the protection is mutual, where the permanence is chosen and choosing is possible. Across the Atlantic, American women fought parallel battles. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 had declared, and language deliberately borrowed from the Declaration of Independence, that all men and women are created equal. The legal road from that declaration to meaningful reform was long and contested and expensive, but it moved. Year by year, case by case, protest by protest, it moved. Minimum marriage age laws began to raise the legal floor, imperfectly, inconsistently. Laws addressing domestic violence began to enter the books. Marital rape was criminalized in the United Kingdom in 1991. In the United States, the last state to criminalize it did so in 1993. These are not ancient dates. The grandmothers of people alive today married under laws that did not recognize their right to refuse their own husbands. There is a version of this history that ends here, with reform, with progress, with the reassurance that things have changed. That version is not wrong. The progress was real, purchased by women who did not always live to benefit from what they fought for. The distance traveled from coverture to legal personhood, from arranged childhood marriage to contested minimum age laws. That distance is real, and it costs something to cover. But the architecture persists in the places where the reforms did not reach. In the communities where child marriage continues today, not as a remnant, but as a functioning system sustained by poverty and inadequate enforcement. In the households where dowry-related violence continues in documented patterns. In the psychological architecture of the woman whose identity has been absorbed so completely into her household that she no longer possesses a language for what she has lost. These are not isolated failures. They are the persistence of a logic. The logic that decided, somewhere in the long history of human organization, that marriage was a mechanism of control, and that the person most controlled by it was also the person least entitled to object. What changes history is not the recognition of that logic, it is the refusal to accept it. Organized, sustained refusal, by the women who signed petitions with names the law would not honor, by the lawyers who argued cases no one thought they could win, by the daughters who asked questions that had been deliberately left unanswered, by the communities that decided their daughters deserved to enter a marriage as persons, not as signatures on a document written without them. Weddings still look the same in many of their essentials: white fabric, flowers, family gathered, music that promises something permanent, the moment at the threshold, the face of someone stepping through a door they are choosing to step through, or believe they are choosing to, which has not always been the same thing. We have made that choice real in many places. We have built legal floors. We have named rights that were not named before. We have moved, in careful and contested increments, closer to the version of marriage that the ceremony always implied but rarely delivered, where the partnership is actual, where the protection is mutual, where the permanence is chosen and choosing is possible. But the history does not disappear because we have moved past parts of it. It remains in the record, or in the absence of record, in the court documents that do not exist because no one was permitted to file them, in the names that appear only as someone's wife, someone's widow, never as themselves, in the photographs where something behind the eyes has already gone quiet. The women who endured this were not abstractions assembled for the instruction of later generations. They were not figures placed in the historical record to make those who came after feel grateful for their progress. They were people, with names that were absorbed into other names, with voices that were redirected into silence by structures too large to argue with and too entrenched to escape, with interior lives that went unrecorded because the systems surrounding them had decided their interior lives were not the point. They bent. They endured. They found ways to hold something of themselves intact inside spaces that were not built to accommodate a full human being. They raised children with the particular, ferocious tenderness of people who understood exactly what was at stake. They passed things forward in the only languages available to them, in recipes, and prayers, and letters, and the specific, deliberate way they taught a daughter to move through a world that had not yet decided she deserved to move through it freely. They were the agreement. They were not asked, not consulted, not once considered. The ceremony promised forever. For too many of them, forever arrived without protection, without witness, without anyone in the ledger recording what it cost to hold a self together inside a contract that had been designed as if a self were not present, as if the person wearing the dress were simply decoration for an arrangement that had already been concluded between other people, in other rooms, using other names. The least history can offer is an honest account of what that cost. What it costs to hold a self together inside a contract designed as if a self were not present. And the least we can do, looking at those photographs, at those eyes, at that particular stillness, is refuse to look away. A ceremony can unite two people, or it can seal a life. The difference has always been power. Whether the person crossing the threshold chose to cross it, whether they could at any point walk back through and be received with dignity on the other side, whether the institution they entered recognized their existence as something worth protecting, not from the world outside, but from the arrangements inside. History's answer, for too long, was no. The record of that answer is what we carry forward, not as an invitation to despair, not as a reason to stop moving in the direction the reformers pointed, but as a demand for honesty, as a reminder that the comfort of ceremony has, for most of human history, concealed the discomfort of the arrangement beneath it, and that the work of making the ceremony honest, of making the vow reflect an actual equality rather than perform one, has never been finished. It has only ever been continued.